Number 1. Mark Ciavarella. He was the kind of judge parents thought they could trust. Strict, disciplined, and unflinching in his belief that consequences shaped character. In a small Pennsylvania courtroom, teenagers stood before him expecting justice, not realizing they were stepping into a system quietly twisted against them. To the outside world, Mark Ciavarella seemed like a hardline authority figure cleaning up youth crime. But behind closed doors, he was part of one of the most disturbing corruption scandals in modern American judicial history, one that would eventually be called Kids for Cash. Mark Arthur Ciavarella Jr. was born in 1950 and built the image of a no-nonsense public servant. He graduated from King's College and the Dickinson School of Law before launching his legal career. In 1996, he became a judge at the Luzerne County Court of Common Pleas in Pennsylvania, presiding over juvenile cases. His public persona was that of a man who believed young offenders needed discipline, not excuses. He called himself a supporter of zero tolerance, the kind of judge who sent kids away for skipped school days, minor fights, or petty theft. To many families in the community, his rulings felt harsh, but they assumed his intentions were rooted in law and order. What nobody saw was how dramatically the system was about to shift. In the early 2000s, Ciavarella and fellow judge Michael Conahan were involved in shutting down the county-run juvenile detention facility. On paper, it sounded like reform, but it was the first move in a larger scheme. Almost immediately after, juvenile offenders were sent to privately owned detention centers, PA Childcare and Western PA Childcare. What wasn't public then was that the judges had secretly made deals with the companies running those facilities. The harsher Ciavarella's rulings, the more those facilities stayed full, and the more money moved under the table. The sentencing numbers were staggering. Kids as young as 11 were sent away for infractions that typically resulted in warnings or community service. Hearings often lasted just a few minutes. Many teens had no lawyers, no due process, and no chance. One girl was sent to a detention center for mocking a vice principal online. Another, only 12 years old, was locked up for a minor schoolyard scuffle. Parents would walk into the courtroom expecting guidance and leave in shock, their children taken from them in handcuffs. The scheme lasted for years before anyone uncovered the truth. Between 2003 and 2008, Ciavarella and Conahan received nearly $2.8 million in illegal payments. The money was laundered through shell companies and disguised as finder's fees or rental income. The judges hid their involvement and denied wrongdoing, even as suspicion grew. Complaints trickled in, families spoke about unfair sentencing, defense attorneys raised questions, and advocacy groups noted the unusually high detention rates. Still, the machine continued. The turning point came when the FBI and IRS began investigating financial discrepancies linked to the private detention facilities. A broader federal probe revealed how deep the corruption ran. In January 2009, the scheme finally came to light. Ciavarella and Conahan were charged with fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. The story exploded in national media under the banner Kids for Cash, casting a harsh spotlight on juvenile justice and private incarceration. Even as the allegations mounted, Ciavarella tried to defend himself. He claimed the payments were legal and unrelated to his rulings. But prosecutors pointed to case after case where children were given disproportionate sentences for minor offenses, filling the private facilities and boosting profits. One mother described how her son, who had no prior record, was sent away for driving his parents' car without permission. Another family said their daughter spent months in detention for trespassing in an abandoned building. In 2011, after a high-profile trial, Ciavarella was convicted on multiple counts: racketeering, money laundering, conspiracy, and fraud. The judge overseeing his case called his actions a tragedy of epic proportions. Prosecutors emphasized not only the financial corruption, but the human cost. Over 4,000 juvenile convictions were eventually overturned because they were tainted by his misconduct. Thousands of young lives were disrupted, and many carried the trauma of detention into adulthood. Ciavarella was sentenced to 28 years in federal prison. He was 61 at the time, making it unlikely he would ever walk free again. Families of the affected children described relief but also anger that it had taken so long for justice to reach the man who had controlled their fates. Some parents attended the sentencing just to see him led away in cuffs, the same way their children once were. Today, Ciavarella is incarcerated at a federal correctional facility. He has filed appeals and motions over the years, arguing about sentencing guidelines and fairness, but none have released him from the consequences of his actions. His co-conspirator, Michael Conahan, received a separate sentence, and both became symbols of a justice system that had failed the very people it was supposed to protect. The story left a lasting mark on the country. It triggered reforms in Pennsylvania's juvenile courts, new protections to ensure minors have legal representation, and national debate about privatized prisons. The state eventually paid tens of millions in settlements to the victims. Imagine being a teenager standing in front of a judge, believing this adult in a robe holds the power to decide your future with fairness. Imagine finding out, years later, that your punishment wasn't about justice at all, but profit. That's the legacy of Mark Ciavarella. His courtroom was not a place of protection or second chances. It was a pipeline. Even now, his name brings up the question no parent wants to ask. What happens when the people meant to uphold the law twist it for themselves? When fairness is sold and childhood becomes currency, the damage doesn't end with one sentence. It echoes across a generation. Number 2, Michael Conahan. He was the kind of authority figure people didn't question. Reserved, polished, and deliberate with his words, Michael Conahan carried himself like someone who belonged in power. To the public, he appeared as a disciplined legal mind who worked his way up the judicial ranks. But the calm exterior hid something calculated, because while he sat in a position meant to protect due process, he was quietly shaping a system that would profit from young lives being pushed into detention. Michael T. Conahan was born in 1952 and spent years building his legal reputation in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania. He served in private practice before becoming a magistrate and eventually a judge. In 2002, he rose to become the president judge of the Court of Common Pleas. With that title came more than respect. He gained control over budgets, contracts, and administrative decisions. It was an opportunity he would soon exploit. Around the early 2000s, a plan began to unfold. Conahan used his authority to defund the county-run juvenile detention center, claiming it was outdated and inadequate. On paper, it looked like a push for reform. In reality, it was a calculated step toward steering juvenile cases into privately owned detention facilities. That's when PA Childcare and Western PA Childcare entered the picture. Centers run by developers and businessmen ready to profit from every bed filled. Conahan wasn't working alone. His longtime colleague, Judge Mark Ciavarella, handled the sentencing side. Conahan handled the infrastructure. Together, they created the pipeline. Ciavarella would funnel kids into detention, and Conahan made sure the contracts and money flowed behind the scenes. The payments weren't small. Over the span of several years, Conahan and Ciavarella received nearly $2.8 million in illicit money disguised as rental income, consulting fees, and shell company transfers. The fallout impacted thousands of minors. Teens were locked up for infractions that normally resulted in warnings: fights at school, truancy, petty theft, prank-level vandalism. Many hearings lasted mere minutes. Some children didn't even have lawyers present. Parents assumed the judges were strict but fair, not realizing the decisions were tied to financial gain. While Ciavarella delivered the sentences, none of it would have been possible without Conahan eliminating alternatives and securing the deals to keep the detention centers full. For years, the scheme stayed buried. Conahan's polished demeanor and status helped shield him from early suspicion. He attended events, upheld his public image, and avoided the spotlight while the juvenile system quietly shifted beneath the surface. But things began to unravel when federal investigators noticed irregular financial activity tied to the detention centers. Complaints from families, advocacy groups, and juvenile justice organizations added to the pressure. A broader investigation finally exposed the true arrangement. In January 2009, the federal government brought charges against both judges. Conahan was accused of fraud, conspiracy, racketeering, and money laundering. His role had been more administrative than courtroom-based, but no less damaging. Prosecutors presented evidence of bank transfers, offshore accounts, and falsified agreements. He initially signed a plea deal in 2009, admitting to participating in the conspiracy, though legal maneuvering delayed the final outcome. The media quickly labeled it the Kids for Cash scandal. It became a national symbol of what happens when the justice system is corrupted from within. Families began to speak out publicly, detailing how their children were taken away for trivial offenses. One mother described how her son was sent to detention for accidentally damaging a friend's property with a BB gun. Another family said their daughter was locked up after creating a fake MySpace page mocking a school official. The outrage only grew as the scale became clear. Over 4,000 juvenile convictions were eventually thrown out because the process had been tainted by conflict of interest and financial motive. In 2011, after protracted legal proceedings, Conahan was sentenced to 17 and a half years in federal prison. While Ciavarella's charges centered heavily on sentencing and racketeering, Conahan's revolved around dismantling public structures and helping engineer the private deal. Unlike Ciavarella, he expressed remorse during sentencing, acknowledging the harm done to the community and the court's credibility. Whether that remorse was genuine or strategic remained a matter of opinion. He began serving his sentence at a federal facility in Florida. Over time, health issues emerged, and in 2020, during the height of COVID-19, he was granted compassionate release to home confinement after his legal team argued he was at risk due to pre-existing conditions. His release caused backlash among families affected by the scandal, who felt that the damage he caused didn't disappear with age or illness. While technically still under federal supervision, he no longer serves his sentence behind bars. The scandal forced major reforms in how Pennsylvania handles juvenile proceedings. Laws were strengthened to guarantee minors legal representation, limit judicial discretion, and oversee private detention agreements nationwide. The story became a case study in ethics training for attorneys and judges across the country. Imagine being a parent who trusted a judge to act in your child's best interest, only to find out years later that the system was rigged at the highest levels. Imagine realizing that a person tasked with overseeing justice had instead overseen a profit model built on conviction rates and incarceration quotas. That's the legacy Michael Conahan left behind. Not a courtroom career defined by law, but a scandal that exposed how quickly justice can be twisted when money enters the equation. Even now, his name raises the same uncomfortable question: how many lives can be derailed in silence before anyone notices? Number 3. Paul Pozonsky. He spent years presenting himself as a judge who believed in accountability and rehabilitation, especially in cases involving addiction. In Washington County, Pennsylvania, Paul Pozonsky built his reputation overseeing criminal cases and even presiding over a specialty drug court. To defendants and court staff, he seemed like someone who valued structure and second chances. What no one realized at first was that the very evidence he was sworn to protect was disappearing, right under his watch. Paul E. Pozonsky began his legal career in the 1980s, working his way up through the justice system. He eventually became a Court of Common Pleas judge, and his assignments included handling narcotics cases. His position granted him access to drug evidence, confidential files, and storage protocols the public assumed were secure. From the outside, he appeared to be a steady hand in cases involving controlled substances, often sentencing offenders based on the very evidence logged from their arrests. But behind closed doors, something unusual was happening. Over time, local officials started noticing discrepancies in evidence storage. Sealed containers of cocaine were being checked out for unexplained reasons, often under Pozonsky's authorization. Some evidence was destroyed without standard documentation, while other samples simply went missing. For a long time, there was no clear proof of why, only suspicion that something was off. Investigators didn't act immediately. Judges aren't typically the first people suspected of tampering with narcotics evidence, but the pattern kept emerging, and the district attorney's office started asking questions. Then Pozonsky quietly resigned from his position in 2012 and accepted a job in Alaska's Workers' Compensation Board. The timing raised eyebrows. Soon after his departure, a deeper audit of the evidence room revealed exactly what people feared. Entire packages of cocaine tied to active criminal cases were gone. That suspicion turned into a full investigation. Auditors discovered that Pozonsky had personally ordered law enforcement officials to bring drug evidence from secure storage to his courtroom without clear cause. In multiple instances, he then removed portions of that evidence and replaced them with similar-looking substances like baking soda. Over time, more than 500 grams of cocaine were unaccounted for or contaminated. It wasn't a clerical error. It was deliberate. When facing investigators, Pozonsky initially denied wrongdoing. He argued that his orders were part of routine disposal procedures or legal review. But the evidence trail was too specific. Containers logged with precise weights no longer matched their records. In some cases, his fingerprints were on sealed bags only evidence technicians were supposed to handle. The truth finally came out. He had been taking cocaine from evidence for his own personal use. In May 2013, he was charged with multiple counts, including theft, obstruction, tampering with evidence, and possession of controlled substances. The idea that a sitting judge had stolen drugs from his own courtroom stunned the legal community. Cases he had presided over were now under scrutiny, as defense lawyers questioned whether outcomes were compromised by his actions. Faced with mounting proof, Pozonsky waived his right to trial and accepted a plea deal. In 2015, he pleaded guilty to charges of theft by unlawful taking, obstruction of the administration of law, and possession of a controlled substance. During sentencing, prosecutors emphasized not only the illegal acts but the betrayal of public trust. They argued that his actions threatened to overturn convictions and derail years of criminal prosecutions. He was sentenced to 30 months of intermediate punishment, including house arrest, probation, and mandatory treatment programs. Many people felt the sentence was light compared to the damage caused. Some of the criminal cases linked to the stolen cocaine had to be revisited. Prosecutors were forced to either drop charges or negotiate new deals because their evidence had been compromised by the very judge meant to safeguard it. Pozonsky eventually returned to Pennsylvania to serve his sentence and compliance conditions. His law license was suspended, and his career in the judiciary ended for good. His time in Alaska also came under review, and he resigned from that role as well. The case became a symbol of how authority can hide misconduct until it seeps into the system. Imagine being a defendant in drug court, believing the judge above you was unbiased and fair, only to discover he was using the very substances you were being prosecuted over. Imagine years of cases suddenly thrown into question because the chain of evidence was tainted by a single person with unchecked access. That was the legacy Pozonsky left behind. Not just a crime, but a collapse in confidence for everyone who walked into his courtroom. Even now, his story raises a quiet reminder. When power shields misconduct, the damage isn't measured only in laws broken, but in the trust that disappears with it. Number 4, Tim Nolan. He spent decades building influence in politics, law, and public service. To many in northern Kentucky, Tim Nolan looked like an unlikely figure to end up in a criminal courtroom. He was a former district judge, a school board member, and even chaired a county campaign during a presidential election cycle. But while he projected an image of authority and community leadership, investigators would later uncover a hidden pattern of exploitation that stretched back years. Timothy Nolan was born in 1947 and became a notable figure in Campbell County, Kentucky. By the 1990s, he had already served as a district judge, handling misdemeanors and local disputes. After leaving the bench, he didn't disappear from public life. He continued working as a lawyer, engaged in real estate, took on civic positions, and remained politically active. In 2016, he gained even more visibility after becoming a campaign chair for a presidential candidate in his region. With his status and history in law, most people assumed he understood the limits of legal and ethical responsibility. But beneath that public profile, he was preying on some of the most vulnerable people he could find. Investigators discovered that Nolan had used his influence to manipulate women, many of them struggling financially or battling addiction. The case began to open in 2017 when a woman walked into a police station and reported that Nolan had threatened her with jail if she didn't comply with him. That allegation led authorities to look deeper, and what they found didn't stop with one victim. As detectives conducted interviews, multiple people came forward with eerily similar accounts. Nolan approached women who were in desperate circumstances, some homeless, some dealing with substance dependency, others trying to avoid legal trouble. He offered money, housing, or help with court cases, but behind those offers were threats and coercive pressure. Victims later said he told them that if they didn't do what he wanted, he would use his past connections with law enforcement and the courts to ruin them. The investigation expanded fast. The Kentucky Attorney General's office formed a special unit to handle the case. The list of charges grew: human trafficking, witness tampering, unlawful transactions with minors, prostitution-related offenses, and retaliation against accusers. Some of the incidents dated back to 2011. At the time of his arrest in May 2017, Nolan was 70 years old and still active in politics and public boards. His background as a former judge made the accusations even more shocking to the communities who had trusted him. Over the months that followed, prosecutors compiled multiple victim statements and uncovered messages and records showing how he used money and threats to maintain control. He faced a total of 28 felony counts. Instead of going to trial, Nolan eventually admitted guilt. In February 2018, he pleaded guilty to 21 charges, including human trafficking of a minor, unlawful imprisonment, and witness tampering. During the plea process, victims described being lured, pressured, or blackmailed into situations they couldn't escape. Sentencing took place in 2018 at the Campbell County Circuit Court. Prosecutors asked the court to consider his long career in law and his calculated abuse of power. The judge agreed, emphasizing the danger in someone using a legal background as leverage to silence and intimidate vulnerable people. Tim Nolan was sentenced to 20 years in prison. At the time of his sentencing, he tried to downplay the harm, suggesting his actions were misunderstood. But the court record showed a consistent pattern of predatory behavior spanning multiple years. He was also ordered to register as a lifetime offender and barred from positions involving public authority or contact with potential victims. Some of the women who spoke during the proceedings said they had been afraid to report him for years, specifically because of his previous role as a judge. Even though he was in his 70s, the sentence reflected the seriousness of the crimes. Currently, Nolan is incarcerated in Kentucky, serving his 20-year sentence in the state prison system. With his age and the length of the term, his chances of returning to public life are effectively gone. His legal appeals have not undone the conviction, and he is unlikely to secure early release. Imagine living in a community where a former judge and political figure has the ability to shape reputations, influence officials, and appear untouchable. Now imagine being one of the people he targeted, told that no one would believe you, or worse, that he could make your life fall apart with one phone call. For years, his outward respectability hid what was happening in private. His case became a warning about how authority doesn't always protect the innocent. Sometimes it shields the abuser. And when someone with legal training, public influence, and decades of credibility uses all of that to manipulate others, the fallout isn't just criminal, it fractures trust in the system itself. Tim Nolan once sat on the bench as a judge. Years later, he sits in a prison cell as an inmate. The title changed, but only after the truth finally surfaced. Number 5. Dawn Gentry. She wasn't the type of judge people immediately suspected of scandal. On the surface, Dawn Gentry seemed like a rising legal figure in northern Kentucky, confident, well-connected, and trusted enough to preside over family court cases involving custody, abuse claims, and the lives of children. But behind the reputation was a pattern of behavior that turned her courtroom into something unrecognizable from the standards she was sworn to uphold. Dawn Marie Gentry was appointed as a family court judge in Kenton County in 2016. She quickly became known in the courthouse for her assertive personality and hands-on involvement with staff. Her role put her in charge of sensitive cases affecting families in crisis. People expected professionalism. What they eventually got was chaos disguised as leadership. Not long after settling into the position, Gentry began using her role to build a circle of personal allies. Attorneys and employees described a work environment that felt less like a courtroom and more like a private network where loyalty mattered more than qualifications. She appointed friends to advisory boards, reassigned people who didn't fall in line, and pressured others to support her political campaign. One of the first signs of serious misconduct surfaced when a former court employee came forward with concerns. That opened the door to more allegations. Claims that Gentry had coerced staff into political work on her behalf, encouraged personal relationships in the office, and retaliated against anyone who questioned her decisions. As investigators interviewed court personnel, the details kept growing. Sources described her using her judicial influence to pressure attorneys to donate to her campaign or appear at fundraising events. Some reported that if they didn't go along with her demands, their cases would face delays or unfavorable treatment. In a family court setting, where decisions can affect parental rights and child safety, those allegations were especially troubling. Witnesses also spoke about inappropriate conduct involving individuals she hired or promoted. Several employees said she created a social environment in chambers that crossed professional lines. That included inviting people she was personally involved with into courthouse roles and involving them in staff activities unrelated to court business. At least one employee said they were expected to participate in after-hours conduct they were not comfortable with, but feared retaliation if they refused. As complaints stacked up, the Kentucky Judicial Conduct Commission launched a formal investigation. Gentry initially dismissed the claims as exaggerated or politically motivated, but interviews and internal records told a different story. She was accused of retaliating against employees she believed were disloyal, pressuring staff and lawyers to support her re-election campaign, allowing personal relationships to influence court staffing and decisions, using her position to create a social circle from courthouse personnel, and failing to maintain impartiality in cases before her. In December 2019, she faced multiple counts of judicial misconduct. The proceedings laid out how her leadership blurred the line between public duty and personal ambition. Family court litigants had no idea that decisions affecting them were made in an environment where favoritism and coercion had become routine. Rather than stepping down, Gentry attempted to defend her actions. But during the hearings, former colleagues testified about the pressure and fear they experienced under her oversight. One attorney said privately disagreeing with her could cost someone their career. Another described how professional reputations were damaged if they refused to do campaign work for her. In 2020, the Judicial Conduct Commission reached a final decision. Gentry was removed from the bench, making her one of the few Kentucky judges in recent history to be stripped of her position for misconduct. The ruling cited her abuse of power, lack of impartiality, and violation of ethical standards expected from the judiciary. After losing her seat, she faced additional fallout. Her law license came under review, and former employees considered civil action related to her conduct. She also lost the judicial election she had been campaigning to secure, ending her rise in public service. While she did not face criminal charges like others on this list, the severity of the misconduct was enough to end her career and damage the court's credibility. Imagine being a parent walking into family court, expecting fairness in a decision about custody or protection. Now imagine learning that the judge in charge was more focused on personal alliances and power plays than objectivity. In a setting where people are already vulnerable, even small abuses of authority can carry lifelong effects. Dawn Gentry's case didn't involve hidden financial kickbacks or schemes with private companies. Instead, it showed how authority can be misused in quieter but still damaging ways, through favoritism, coercion, and retaliation. Her removal became a reminder that corruption isn't always about money. Sometimes it's about ego, influence, and the belief that a robe places someone above accountability. Her courtroom was meant to resolve family crises. Instead, it became the center of one. Number 6. Tracie Hunter. When Tracie Hunter became a judge in Hamilton County, Ohio, her appointment made headlines. She was the first African American elected to the juvenile court bench in that county, and her supporters saw her as a voice for fairness and reform. But within a few years, her name would become known for a very different reason: allegations of misconduct, a criminal conviction, and a courtroom drama that ended with her being physically escorted to jail. Tracie Marie Hunter came into office in 2012 after a long legal battle. Her election had been contested, and she fought in court before finally being seated. She began her judicial career focused on issues involving minors and child protection cases. To some, she appeared determined to challenge systems she believed were flawed. But inside the courthouse, critics claimed she created tension with staff and strained relationships with prosecutors and administrators. The situation escalated when questions arose about how she was handling certain cases. By 2013, a grand jury opened an investigation into her conduct. The allegations centered around her alleged involvement in trying to influence outcomes related to her brother, Stephen Hunter, who worked as a youth corrections officer and was facing disciplinary action. Prosecutors said she used her position to gain confidential documents about his case and tried to impact the internal process reviewing his conduct. In 2014, Hunter was indicted on 9 felony counts, including tampering with evidence, misuse of her office, theft in office, and having an unlawful interest in a public contract. The most serious claim was that she used her judicial authority to obtain non-public documents and shield her brother from consequences. During the investigation, court employees testified that she pressured staff to give her access to restricted records. The trial that followed was closely watched. Hunter maintained that she was being unfairly targeted for political and racial reasons. Her defense argued that the prosecution exaggerated routine judicial actions and that she acted within her authority. But prosecutors presented testimony and documentation that showed she crossed legal boundaries to benefit a family member. In October 2014, after a long and contentious process, the jury found her guilty on 1 felony count, having an unlawful interest in a public contract. The jury was deadlocked on the other 8 charges, which were later dismissed. The conviction alone was enough to trigger disciplinary action and remove her from the bench. In 2015, she was sentenced to 6 months in jail and 1 year of probation. The sentence sparked protests from her supporters, who claimed she was a victim of bias and retaliation. Over the next several years, she filed numerous appeals to overturn the conviction and delay incarceration. For a long time, those legal maneuvers kept her out of jail, but the conviction remained. The moment that brought national attention came in July 2019. After exhausting her appeals, the court ordered her to begin serving her sentence. When she appeared for the hearing, tensions were high. As the judge read the order, deputies approached to take her into custody. She stood still, refusing to walk on her own, and officers lifted her by the arms and carried her out of the courtroom as supporters shouted in protest. Cameras captured the scene, and the video quickly spread across news outlets and social media. During her incarceration, she served part of her sentence before being released early on work detail credit. Her law license was suspended, and she has not returned to the bench. To this day, she continues to argue that the prosecution was politically motivated and that she was punished for challenging existing systems. However, the conviction still stands. Imagine being a judge trusted to interpret laws, only to face trial under those same laws. Imagine the public watching as someone once seen as a symbol of justice has to defend their own actions in front of a jury. Whether people saw her as a cautionary tale or a target of politics, the outcome was the same. Her legal career ended not with retirement, but with a felony on her record. Tracie Hunter's story is different from others fueled by bribery or financial gain. Her case hinged on influence, boundaries, and using judicial power to protect someone close to her. In a system that relies on separation of personal interest from legal authority, Even one act of interference can tear down a career. Her rise was historic, but her fall made history too, in a way no judge aims for. Number 7. Herman Thomas. In his courtroom, Judge Herman Thomas projected an image of discipline and control. He served in Mobile County, Alabama, and for years was considered a respected figure in the local justice system. He handled criminal cases involving people who often had limited resources or little power to fight back. What nobody saw early on was how he allegedly used that imbalance to his advantage, turning his authority into something far from lawful. Herman Thomas began his judicial career in the 1990s, working his way up to circuit judge. He was one of the few black judges in the state at the time, and his presence on the bench was viewed by some as progress in a region with a complicated legal history. But as rumors began circulating over his conduct behind the scenes, it became harder to separate the public perception from the private reality. The first signs of trouble emerged when people started questioning why certain defendants were being taken out of jail and brought to unusual private meetings. These weren't official hearings and weren't always documented. Eventually, whispers turned into formal complaints. Several inmates claimed Thomas had offered to reduce their sentences or adjust their probation in exchange for personal favors. Others said he physically disciplined them in ways that had no place in a courtroom or jail facility. By 2007, the Alabama Judicial Inquiry Commission began looking into his conduct. Their investigation uncovered allegations from multiple former inmates who said Thomas had taken them from the county jail to a private location, often his office, or in some reports, a different area of the courthouse, with no guards present. Some claimed he hit them under the guise of teaching discipline. Others said he made comments suggesting they owed him something in return for helping their cases. These weren't isolated claims. They came from different defendants at different times. In 2009, a grand jury handed down a sweeping indictment. Thomas was charged with more than 50 counts, including ethics violations, assault, extortion, and using his position for personal benefit. Some counts involved allegations of inappropriate physical contact during those private meetings. Prosecutors described a pattern where young male defendants were singled out, removed from standard legal procedures, and pressured into situations where consent didn't exist because of his power over their freedom. Thomas denied the accusations and argued that his actions were being distorted. His legal team claimed the case was based on unreliable witnesses, people with criminal records who had reasons to lie. Despite his defense, the Alabama Court of the Judiciary forced him to resign from the bench before the criminal trial began. Losing his judicial seat was the first major consequence, but not the last. As the case moved forward, prosecutors struggled to get every charge to stick. Some counts were dismissed before trial, and others fell apart due to evidentiary issues or conflicting testimony. In 2009, the criminal case reached a critical moment when the prosecution dropped most of the charges mid-trial, citing concerns about how the jury might interpret the testimony. Ultimately, Thomas was acquitted on all remaining counts, but an acquittal in criminal court didn't erase what the Judicial Ethics Commission had already uncovered. He had already resigned to avoid being forcibly removed. The State Bar Association took action to strip him of his law license. Even though he technically avoided a criminal conviction, his legal career was effectively over. The public reaction was divided. Some people believed he escaped liability due to legal technicalities. Others argued the case was too complicated, with too little physical evidence and too much reliance on the word of inmates. Yet the sheer number of accusations and the consistency among them left an impression that never faded. Today, Herman Thomas lives outside the legal system he once helped run. He cannot serve as a judge again, and his name is regularly brought up when discussions about judicial misconduct arise. What stands out in his story isn't just the nature of the allegations, it's the way power can operate when oversight fails. Imagine being a defendant with no money for a private lawyer, standing before a judge who can decide whether you go home or back to a cell. Now imagine that judge calling you into a private room with no witnesses and making offers no one else hears. Whether or not a jury convicts, Trust doesn't survive those questions. Thomas's fall didn't come with a long prison sentence or a dramatic televised verdict. Instead, his legacy collapsed through testimony, ethics hearings, and the irreversible loss of authority. In the end, the question wasn't what could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, but how far a judge should ever be allowed to act in the shadows. Number 8. Sherry K. Stevens. When people first heard her name in the news, it wasn't because of a headline-making crime. It was because of the growing number of complaints tied to her courtroom. Judge Sherry K. Stevens served in Maricopa County, Arizona, presiding over some of the most high-profile and emotionally charged cases in the state. She wasn't accused of stealing money or taking bribes, but the controversy around her focused on another kind of power: how a judge's influence, attitude, and decisions can shape justice in ways that leave lasting damage. Sherry Stevens built a long career in the Arizona legal system. She handled a wide range of criminal cases over the years, but it was the Jodi Arias trial in the early 2010s that brought her intense public attention. Millions watched the trial unfold, and Stevens became a recognizable figure for the way she managed the proceedings. At first, she was viewed as calm and patient, but behind that came years of criticism from attorneys, defendants, and citizens who claimed she consistently used her bench to intimidate, delay, or silence. Unlike other judges who were caught taking money under the table, Stevens's problems came from allegations of bias, retaliation, and abuses of discretion. Defense attorneys accused her of repeatedly favoring prosecution arguments. Defendants claimed she shut down motions unfairly and dismissed evidence without proper consideration. In some hearings, people in her courtroom described feeling powerless, like outcomes had already been quietly decided. The complaints didn't stop at accusations of bias. Former staff and attorneys alleged that Stevens was quick to hold people in contempt, sometimes over minor disruptions or disagreements. In several cases, members of the public and even legal counsel were removed from the courtroom or threatened with penalties for speaking out of turn. Some attorneys said they avoided her courtroom entirely because they believed their clients would be treated unfairly. One of the most persistent criticisms involved her handling of court delays. Cases dragged out for months or even years, leaving families and defendants stuck in limbo. People claimed she used continuances not because of legal necessity, but as a way to exert control or pressure parties to comply with her expectations. In emotionally heavy cases, delays meant witnesses moved away, memories faded, and evidence lost relevance, affecting outcomes in ways that couldn't be undone. There were also allegations that she allowed sealed or closed proceedings too often, limiting public access to information that normally would be shared in open court. Critics argued that this secrecy made it harder to hold her accountable, especially when rulings raised questions about fairness. Defense teams brought several of her decisions to appellate courts, and some were overturned for procedural errors and misapplications of law. Judicial review boards began receiving formal complaints. Lawyers filed ethics concerns over the way she spoke to defendants and handled sentencing. In some cases, people said her tone bordered on demeaning or dismissive, especially toward individuals representing themselves or those with limited education. Others pointed to guardianship and mental health cases where families said she ignored evidence or rushed to decisions without hearing full testimony. Despite the growing backlash, Stevens continued to serve for years. Judges rarely face criminal prosecution for misconduct unless money or fraud is involved, and much of her controversy existed in the gray area between unethical behavior and legally protected discretion. Still, investigations were opened to evaluate claims of partiality and abuse of authority. Public defenders and private attorneys submitted written accounts describing patterns of intimidation and rulings that appeared retaliatory. Eventually, the pressure caught up with her. As more attorneys spoke out and more cases were appealed, her reputation shifted. People who once respected her for controlling a courtroom began to question whether that control had crossed into something harmful. Although she was never arrested or convicted of a criminal act, her legacy reflects a different kind of judicial breakdown, one where fairness is eroded not by bribes or schemes, but by unchecked power and a pattern of decisions that left people feeling the system was stacked against them. Today, Sherry Stevens is no longer on the bench. She stepped away from the role after years of rising scrutiny. For some, her departure came too late. Defendants who went through her courtroom still talk about sentences they believe were harsher than necessary, hearings that felt predetermined, and motions she dismissed without explanation. Imagine walking into court believing you have one chance to defend your future, only to feel like the judge has already decided your fate before you speak. Imagine spending months waiting for a hearing, only to be delayed again without reason. Even without a cash payoff or a criminal charge, the damage done by that kind of power is real. Sherry Stevens' story is a reminder that corruption isn't always financial. Sometimes it's procedural, sometimes it's subtle, and sometimes the most dangerous thing in a courtroom isn't what's being taken, it's what's being ignored. Number 9, Michael Maggio. For years, Judge Michael Maggio presented himself as a conservative, by-the-book jurist in Arkansas. He handled civil and criminal matters, spoke at legal events, and even sought higher office. But behind that professional image was a deal that would eventually cost him his career, his judgeship, and his freedom. What seemed like an ordinary campaign contribution turned out to be part of a secret exchange, one that connected politics, money, and judicial power in a way that broke the law. Maggio served as a circuit judge in the 20th Judicial District of Arkansas, covering Faulkner, Van Buren, and Searcy counties. He had a reputation for being outspoken and occasionally controversial in his rulings. But the real trouble began in 2013 and 2014, when he quietly launched a campaign for a position on the Arkansas Court of Appeals. That election bid is what opened the door to everything that followed. During his campaign, Maggio sought financial backing from wealthy donors and political groups. One of those donors was nursing homeowner Michael Morton, a powerful figure in the state. Morton's company had been hit with a civil lawsuit involving the wrongful death of a resident at one of his facilities. A local jury awarded the victim's family a $5.2 million verdict, one of the largest of its kind in Arkansas. But before the judgment was finalized, the case passed through Maggio's courtroom. What investigators later uncovered was a coordinated effort to funnel campaign donations to Maggio in exchange for reducing that verdict. In early 2014, Morton directed tens of thousands of dollars in contributions through political action committees that supported Maggio's campaign. Around the same time, Maggio lowered the nursing home verdict from $5.2 million down to $1 million, cutting more than 80% of the jury's decision. The timing was too precise to dismiss. Prosecutors found text messages, financial records, and communications that connected Morton's donations to the reduced judgment. Maggio never publicly admitted to the connection at first, but the facts became hard to ignore. What began as quiet suspicion quickly escalated into a full-scale ethics and criminal investigation. Then another problem surfaced. During his campaign, Maggio participated in an online message board where he posted inappropriate comments about high-profile cases, sexual assault victims, and adopted children. When reporters tied those posts back to him, he withdrew from the Court of Appeals race. But the misconduct involving the nursing home case was far more serious than the online controversy. In 2014, the Arkansas Judicial Discipline and Disability Commission began disciplinary proceedings. Maggio resigned from the bench rather than face a formal removal hearing. But his resignation didn't stop the federal investigation already underway. By 2015, a grand jury indicted him on bribery and mail fraud charges. The Department of Justice alleged that Maggio knowingly accepted campaign donations in exchange for using his judicial authority to change the outcome of the wrongful death case. Federal prosecutors said the public trust had been traded for political gain. In 2015, he pleaded guilty to one count of bribery. During the plea process, he admitted that he corruptly accepted contributions with the understanding that he would reduce the civil judgment. The case drew national attention because it highlighted how a judge could manipulate justice not through violence or coercion, but through quiet political transactions that most people never see. In 2016, he was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. The judge, in his sentencing hearing, emphasized that Maggio had not just influenced a case, he had undermined the entire foundation of judicial integrity. The family of the nursing home victim spoke in court, saying their trust in the system was shattered by what he did. His sentence reflected not only the financial damage, but the betrayal of his duty. Maggio began serving his sentence in 2017 at a federal facility. He later tried to appeal and reduce his time, claiming he had acted out of poor judgment rather than deliberate corruption. His motions were denied. He remains a disbarred former judge with a federal conviction that ended his career and erased any chance of holding public office again. Imagine being part of a family that fought through the legal system, gathered evidence, testified, and trusted a jury's verdict, only to have it cut down in one stroke of a pen by the judge who was supposed to be impartial. Imagine learning that the ruling wasn't based on law, but on money moving through campaign committees behind the scenes. Michael Maggio's case didn't involve violence, trafficking, or stolen evidence. It involved something quieter, but just as damaging: a judge using his position not for justice, but for favors. In a courtroom, trust is the only thing that gives a ruling meaning. When that trust is sold, the law stops being law and becomes a transaction. Number 10. John C. Roach Jr. To the public eye, Judge John C. Roach Jr. presented the image of a polished and respected Kentucky jurist. He served as a family court judge in Fayette County, handling high-stakes cases involving custody, divorce, guardianship, and parental rights. People came into his courtroom expecting structure and fairness, but over time, a different pattern emerged, one defined by bias, retaliation, conflicts of interest, and judicial decisions that sparked outrage far beyond his courtroom. Roach built his legal career steadily, earning a reputation as someone who carried authority with confidence. He presided over cases where emotions were already high and outcomes could change the course of entire families. In a setting where judges are expected to remain neutral, his rulings increasingly drew controversy. Attorneys and litigants began to accuse him of overstepping boundaries, ignoring due process, and using his position to punish those who challenged him. One of the most publicized controversies involved decisions that seemed to favor certain attorneys and disadvantage others without clear justification. Defense lawyers reported that Roach appeared to retaliate against those who questioned his rulings. Some said he restricted their ability to speak in court, rushed hearings, or blocked evidence from being presented. In family court, where the stakes include children's futures, those actions had real consequences. As more cases piled up, allegations of judicial misconduct grew louder. Parents claimed Roach issued rulings without proper hearings, ignored recommendations from guardians ad litem, and made decisions that lacked transparency. Some described being denied the chance to fully defend themselves before losing custody or being sanctioned. Others claimed he made off-the-record remarks that showed preconceived bias long before rulings were finalized. Complaints began reaching the Kentucky Judicial Conduct Commission. Attorneys filed reports about intimidation and threats from the bench. Court employees described internal pressure and an environment where questioning his decisions could cost someone their role in the system. What surfaced repeatedly was the idea that he treated the courtroom as a place where his personal authority outweighed the legal process. One of the most talked about issues involved his handling of sealed cases and closed-door proceedings. Critics claimed he shielded certain rulings from public view, making it harder to challenge his decisions or hold him accountable. Even when appeals were filed, families said the process had moved so far ahead that damage had already been done. The complaints eventually triggered a formal review. While Roach was not charged with a crime like some other judges on this list, he faced serious ethical scrutiny over how he wielded judicial power. The concern wasn't about money changing hands, but about fairness being replaced by personal influence. The judiciary exists to protect citizens from bias, not reinforce it, and Roach's rulings increasingly raised questions about whether justice in his courtroom depended on which side you were on. He ultimately faced disciplinary action tied to these allegations. Rather than risk removal through a formal hearing, he stepped away from the bench amid growing pressure. That departure didn't erase the consequences his decisions left behind. Families who passed through his courtroom continued to appeal cases he presided over, and some attorneys pushed for policy changes to prevent similar abuses. Imagine going into court to secure custody of your child, believing the judge will weigh facts and testimony fairly. Now imagine realizing that the person making the decision has already formed an opinion based on who your lawyer is, or worse, how much he dislikes being challenged. When power leans that far in one direction, justice doesn't just bend, it breaks. John C. Roach Jr. didn't end up in federal prison or face bribery charges, but his career is a reminder that corruption isn't always about money. Sometimes it shows up in the form of unchecked authority, personal grudges, and decisions made from the bench without room for defense. A judge doesn't have to exchange cash to damage lives. Sometimes all it takes is a gavel and the belief that no one will stop them.